Greetings, Ronald.
Greetings. How are you, Donna?
I am doing okay. Thank you for asking. Thank you for joining us again at this critical time. I know that you and others who are doing this immigrant rights work are really busy right now trying to keep asylum and asylum rights alive. People are hearing a lot of rumors. I'm sure for folks that are not knee deep or neck deep or eyeballs deep in this work as we are, aren't really clear what's going on. Can you please help people to understand what is happening right now? People understand there's some kind of border thing that's being tossed around. Help us to really get a sense of where we are.
Sure. Yes, it is a lot of different understandings out there. So glad to hopefully be helpful in sharing what is happening. So I think the best way to start would be to go back a little bit in time in terms of, as folks may be aware of, Congress has had trouble these last few years, and also this year, including on passing a budget. And what they have done, instead of passing a new budget for the year, they kind of continued to kick the can down the road with continuing resolutions, or what you'll sometimes hear in the news called CRs, essentially meaning they're just trying to fund the government based on the numbers that they had the year before. They kicked the can down the road to November, then they kicked it down. They kicked the can down the road again in December, and then in December, when folks thought they would figure out something, they kicked the can down down the road again until January. They recently found a way to get this CR, or this budget, to be passed. And what the holdup was that Republicans and Biden and Democrats were all trying to figure out a way to get money for border enforcement, and at the same time get money for the war in Ukraine, the war against Palestinians by Israel, and military support and infrastructure between Taiwan with Taiwan. And so all of that is to say, what they actually ended up doing recently was they took out the war part, so Taiwan, Ukraine, and Israel funding, and they just focused on um, funding for like typical government infrastructure. So they were able to pass that. But now what is happening is that Republicans still want money for border enforcement, and Biden still wants to fund those wars. And so they're working up a way to negotiate in order to get the best of both worlds, so to speak, or what they think is the best of both worlds. And so right now, negotiations are continuing between the Senate, the Biden administration, the House, in order to try to find a way to get border enforcement and funding for those wars.
And so, what's being proposed? Because people are really shocked by what's on the table right now in terms of asylum. What's being proposed?
Well, what's being proposed is essentially to cut asylum as we know it. I think Republicans, they want, I don't think that they know, and they've stated that they want people, quote unquote, to stop coming. And the way they see fit is to completely ignore international law, and to reject all asylum. And so they want to really strip down asylum to something, I wouldn't even call it bare bones, because it's literally nothing. They want to completely get rid of asylum, and they're holding that uh, as their leverage in order to say, hey, if you do that, Biden, we're gonna vote to let go of money in order so you can fund the war in Israel, Ukraine, etc. And so that's really what it's coming down to, is that Republicans want this, Biden wants this, and the negotiation right now is like, hey, if you cut out asylum and you stop the quote unquote chaos at the border, we'll let you send some more tanks to Ukraine and Israel. And that's what's happening, and that's what's being discussed. And unfortunately, the analysis being made by this administration is that that price to pay, which is to essentially cut out asylum as we know it, um, is worth it if it means that they're going to be able to continue their wars abroad.
Let's talk about asylum because I think there's so much misinformation and disinformation about what asylum is. Like often we hear people talking about folks illegally crossing the border, right? And really not looking at claiming asylum as a human right, as part of US law, to help folks to understand what this asylum is supposed to be about, because it just seems like it's something that's being so politicized that really should not be politicized.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, if you think of it clearly, it's actually pretty straightforward. Someone has the right to request asylum in the United States and to go through a due process of having their asylum application be reviewed. And what is has been happening, especially to Black migrants and migrants of color, is that there's been different ways, whether that is, Title 42 or mass mass mandatory detention. What was it? Different parole programs. All of this has been avenues or ways to restrict that process or to make that process difficult to obtain. And so, essentially, what asylum should be is that for whatever reason you leave where your country of origin, and you would like to apply for asylum in the United States, and you say, "Hey, I want asylum." It doesn't mean you automatically get it, but your application should be processed. And that is being misunderstood as this chaos and people are letting people in, and that's just not what is happening. What is happening is that because they're denying the right for asylum cases to even be received, folks are being detained, um, sent to detained. They're being held in, captive in other countries. All of the things that you're hearing is what is happening, and that is what actually is causing the chaos. Is that people aren't actually able to uh, apply for asylum as they should be based on international law and U.S. law.
It's interesting because, I mean, I think even on a, what do I want to call it, like a regular pop culture type of understanding of asylum, it's like people are fleeing some kind of persecution, right? So there are rules. It's not just like, I want to go to Disneyland. I don't got Disneyland in my country. So here I am coming to the United States. Or even the United States has extracted everything it can out of my country. Therefore, I don't have the capacity to take care of myself and my family. So I'm coming to the United States. It's actually based upon persecution. And there's really strict rules as to who can fit in that or not fit in that. And there's a lot of documentation that you have to provide. There's a lot of hoops you already have to go through. I know BAJI has done a report that you led on externalizing asylum. Talk to us a little bit about that part, because like people are getting stopped and are getting caught up in situations that block them from making their legitimate asylum claims even before they get to that southern US border.
Right. In the narrative of you know uh, stopping the chaos at the border, what we're finding is that the U.S. is using its imperialism and its money to and its influence to essentially push out their border further south. So, meaning into Mexico, into Central America and South America. And what I mean by that is that whether it's paying the governments of those countries or setting up military infrastructure or prisons, they are trying to stop the flow of folks being able to come to the United States border and request asylum, and trying to find ways to encourage those countries to keep those people like essentially locked there, making it more difficult for them to cross that border, saying, "Hey, I don't actually want to stay in Mexico. I want to get to the US." And figuring out ways to provide that influence of whether it's money or infrastructure, whatever, in order to have Mexico be like, "Oh no, like you can't continue your journey. You're stuck here, or you can't continue your journey. You have to stay here. And while we're making you stay here, we're not going to provide you with any health care or any public benefits, food, whatever you may need in order to survive. And so essentially they're pushing their border out, and they're hoping that with their imperialism they're going to be able to have these countries do their bidding of, hey, keep the people that are trying to rightfully claim asylum here in the United States, by you keep them where they are, where you encounter them. And so that is that externalizing asylum process, and we're seeing the United States try to employ that in a variety of different countries down Central America and South America.
And for people to know that you have a right to ask for asylum in the country of your choice,
Right,
meaning that, according to international law, even if I start off in Ghana and there's a bunch of countries that I got to get to between Ghana and the United States, I still have an absolute right to make my request for asylum in the United States. And that is not what's happening. What's happening now is that the United States is using, as you pointed out, Ronald, its imperialistic powers, its money, etc., to get other countries to say, oh, no, you got to apply for asylum here first, whether you want to live here or not. And
right,
particularly for Black migrants, that causes a lot of issues based upon the anti-Blackness that people are experiencing, even who are from those countries, right? So Black people in these countries are talking about the anti-Blackness that they experience, let alone Black folks who are coming from outside those countries and now being required to stay there.
right. And that's a great point, because also some of the proposed changes that are happening in those negotiations that we were speaking of earlier is a permanent transit ban or safe third country ban, which is what you just referred to, essentially meaning like, hey, like if you, even before you can claim asylum in the United States, you got to claim it through any country that you've passed through. And that's not that's not the law. That's illegal, and folks have the right to claim asylum where they would like. And so that is part of what is happening in some of the proposals that are going to effectively strip asylum from what we know into something that really bars many black migrants and people and migrants of color from even getting the opportunity to claim asylum.
What are some of the other proposals that are part of this conversation? And just for people to understand, sorry, I keep going back and forth. That's what a conversation is. That's what we call it. Conversations on the way. Um, you know, this initial conversation was like the White House talking to House Republicans, or there was a talk about that happening. I guess the Senate Democrats were not to be denied. So now they've jumped into it and made it really their situation with the White House. But these proposals, some of them are things that have already been in existence but haven't been permanent, right? Because we're talking about changing the law through
Right.
Congress, right? That haven't been permanent. They've really just been policies that have come out of the White House. And some of them are, things that are taking things to a level they haven't been at before. But a lot of them are really coming out of what the Biden administration, that promised to be fair and humane, has really done. So, and not been fair and humane. So, what are some of the other things that are on the table right now?
Yeah, so on the table right now is, restricting parole programs and authority, expanding expedited removal, heightening the credible fear standards. We mentioned already permanent transit ban or safe third country ban, a new Title 42, capping asylum grants, and just essentially, if all else fails, mass mandatory detention. So essentially detaining folks and making it where it's like, I'm gonna hold you captive so you can't even try to come. So those are the type of proposals that are being talked about and discussed and are up for debate as a way to replace asylum.
And those are big changes. I mean, we look at expulsions. Expulsions are the denial of due process rights. I mean, basically, without even hearing people's claims, people are going to be told that, no room at the inn, thrown onto planes and sent back to either their own countries that they fled from, or to some third country if that third country is willing to accept them. Talk a little bit about that, and that impact again on Black migrants who are not coming from the continental sort of Americas.
Right. Well, I mean, I think I'd be remiss to say if I didn't start with that. these proposals are actually just they stem from bills that have an anti-black agenda, um, previously, in terms of like the 1994 crime bill, the 1996 immigration reforms. Like those policies have set the ground for what folks are proposing now. So these policies that we can understand and want to dismantle, in the criminal justice space, right, are the same policies that are finding their ways into being solutions in the immigration system. Like, we know that jails don't work, and we know that it has a disproportionate impact on Black people in our civil system. And now we're thinking of that proposal as, you know, what would be a good way to, quote unquote, solve the border crisis would be to detain as many of them as possible. And we know what that means if we just look at what has happened in the prison systems in the country already. So a lot of these changes are, or these proposals are anti-Black, and they stem from the policies that we've been trying to dismantle already. And that's where we can understand that it's going to disproportionately impact Black migrants, because we already see what some of these policies have already done to African Americans and Black folks that are already in the country.
Yeah, thinking about those statistics that we know of now, that the Biden administration, or under the Biden administration, the numbers of people being imprisoned in a federal prison is the highest that it's been. And we see the same thing with the immigration prison system, which is again a federal system, again, the highest they've ever been. And we see a disproportionate number of Black people in both of those systems, and that means something. I mean, we're thinking about how much pressure our communities are under to kind of save certain people from themselves, certain electeds from themselves, in terms of these elections coming up. Very difficult to do when we see how the decisions they're making in terms of the policies that they're pushing forward. And so the mass detentions is one aspect. When you think about immigration detention, it's actually built upon the detention of Haitians. Those of you that are like me, old as dirt and twice as funky, will remember how in the 90s that Haitians were detained in Florida and detained in Guantanamo Bay. The first time that people had been imprisoned in that kind of way in the immigration context, while white Cubans were being allowed to come into the country and, run into their green card permanent resident program without a moment behind a bar or a gate. And that's the system, right? And it was built at the same time, as you pointed out, as the mass incarceration system of the 1990s. This idea that you jail the problem, and if the problem is Black, you really jail the problem. And so we've seen even here in LA, where when it came to Mauritanian asylum seekers that had gone through the proper process, quote unquote, had then been taken into ICE custody and literally detained. Last summer, over 120 imprisoned at Adelanto, which is a regular prison, right? But this was the immigration side of the regular prison in Adelanto. And no one else was having that issue. Everyone else was being allowed to come into Los Angeles and, try to figure it out. But these Black migrants were targeted in such a clear way to be imprisoned. And we see that that is happening, particularly in the South, but, just throughout the country, this effort to resolve this issue by either kicking people out through expulsions, locking people up in terms of detention, or even these alternatives to detention, where we're finding in places like New York City that African migrants are those who are got these ankle shackles instead of getting the ice phones and the ice, iWatch or whatever you all call those Apple things, that they're actually getting ankle shackles instead, in the same way that people in the criminal sanction system get ankle shackles. So all of that is just, that continued repetition. And
Right.
so, what is the pressure that's being placed? Because I know that folks are talking about heating up the Senate. I think Biden's getting a pass and that we need to be hitting him up too. But, people are not just laying down and taking it, they're actually doing something. So, what kinds of things are people doing to push back?
People are pushing back by reaching out to their electeds, whether that's on the Senate and congressional level, and even the local level, because let's not forget those senators and those House representatives, they often come back to their districts listening to your local city councilor and your local mayor and the governor. So also putting pressure on your local electeds is something that we have to keep in mind. But that's what a lot of organizations and the partners we work with are doing right now. They are doing their best to reach out to these House representatives, to these senators, and let them know that accepting these proposals is not only bad policy, but it's going to do extreme harm to Black migrants and migrants of color, and it goes against the campaign promises that, especially the Democratic Party and this administration ran on and said they were going to be about. Remember, it was only it's 4 years ago that this administration said they would on day one end Title 42. And it took them 3 years to end Title 42. And now, on the fourth year, we're figuring out a way to bring it back better, bolder, and better. So we have to remember those types of hypocritical moments of this administration and the party, because we're saying that we weren't going to be like the last administration or the Trump administration. And when I say we, I'm not talking about me and you, I'm talking about this Democratic Party, right? They said that they were going to make sure that they're better. There's a moral clarity, and yet now we're talking about bringing more people into extreme harm, denying them their human right, and rejecting international law, all on the basis not for more schooling, uh, not for health care, not for housing, but for war. And so, what folks are doing is trying to call attention to, to their senators, to their House of Representatives, to let them know this is unacceptable. And at the same time, even BAJI and other orgs are trying to do different phone zaps and you know protests, rallies in order to make that point clear. And speaking of the work we're doing, we actually have a phone tap coming up this Thursday. Baji's hosting a phone tap where we're going to be targeting the White House to make sure they hear from us about how this is not unacceptable.
Absolutely. And we'll share information about that before we close in terms of who folks can reach out to get more information. I do want to point out because when you're talking about, the difference and what this administration indicated, the administration, brags about how on day one there was an executive order that was about racial equity and making sure that there's racial equity in everything that's done. And if you've been listening to this show over the years, you recognize that, that hasn't happened, right? And that we've been talking about how, particularly when it comes to immigration, that there seems to be a failure to reckon with the fact that immigration is a racial justice issue. And so I'm thinking about, as usual, the almost 100,000 Ukrainians that were able to come into this country between February and July of last year, I believe it was. Correct me, rescue me if I'm wrong, in terms of the year. And that,
Yeah.
no one thought about it. Like it was so easy for people to wrap. It was so easy for people to wrap their brain around how people needed this support in terms of Ukrainians and how they were fleeing war, but seems so much more difficult for people to wrap their brain around that when it comes to Sudan, when it comes to Cameroon, when it comes to Mali and Mauritania, like it comes to other countries, Haiti, right? Other countries where people really are fleeing persecution, fleeing war, sort of fit all the categories of what it is that you need in order to be someone who gets protection. And that hardly gets talked about. We're not even talking about the Ukrainians anymore that came in to seek asylum or that came in, and were granted refugee status there near automatically. What does that say? What are you hearing in terms of this comparison?
Well, it's the truth, unfortunately. And then I'm also hearing that folks are realizing that there's a difference in treatment that falls along a racial line. Um, white Ukrainians, or as you mentioned previously, white Cubans, there is a difference in treatment and an acknowledgement of the responsibility to those communities versus Black communities, whether it is Cameroonians, Haitians, um, Angolans, Mauritanians. All these folks are finding it a hard time to receive those same support, the same acknowledgement of the need for asylum or support when they're in the country than those other groups. And so a lot of the time we'll see the narrative or the conversation change to there's just not enough resources. We can't accept them all. But yet, when they want to, and when I say this administration want to, there is a way. There's a, as you've mentioned before, there's creativity in the types of policies they're able to formulate and make, and it doesn't have to be mass detention. We have stories of Ukrainians being in those fancy apartments that are coming up in your city, and they're empty because no one can afford them. We have stories of Ukrainians being able to be roomed there. Yet Haitian migrants or a variety of different Black migrants, their experience has been shelters, if that. So, I have to say is what you said, unfortunately, is the truth. And it falls along these racial lines. And so that is something that a lot of orgs are, beginning to bring up more, but BAJI has continued to beat the drum of, if you are going to have a racially equitable country, you can't ignore that in immigration. You can't be racially equitable in this other place. You can't get another Black Supreme Court justice judge and then screw over Black migrants in immigration and then be considered racially equitable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What are some of the demands that Baji and others are making about what should be happening or as opposed to what's happening right now or what's
Right.
proposed to happen right now?
Yeah. So on a helicopter level, I think we're requesting to stop criminalizing migration, to stop surveillance, to stop deportations and expulsions, and respect the right to asylum. And and detail wise, what that means is that we've often had these discussions ourselves in between meetings. Is that no one is against a process. We would just like that process to be equitable and accessible, and that it allows folks in because we know our communities will got us. Our communities will take care of us. But oftentimes the country's intervention often makes it where folks are at the border and they're detained and they're harmed and they're automatically deported, whether it's Title 42 or any of these other egregious policies. So a lot of the time, what we're requesting is, hey, the quote unquote chaos at the border that everyone is trying to manage, the best management is allowing these folks in through a process, get their information. No one's against that. We're not saying just no one can attain their information, get their information. But letting them into the country because our communities got them and they will be able to enter, be safe. They often will find housing. These folks are resourceful. I mean, like you said, if folks are leaving from the Cameroon seeking asylum in the US, the places and the dangers that they've had to traverse is very light work in comparison to what they're going to have to do in America. So a lot of it is just allowing these folks to participate in a process and releasing them to communities would solve a lot of this what I would almost call, if there is, right, I think there's another conversation to have, but if there is this bottleneck at the border, it would solve for that just by simply being more humane and more just and working with these community partners in an efficient way of growing their capacity to receive folks that are looking to claim asylum in the United States.
Absolutely. People aren't asking for much.
No.
Just have an asylum process that works and that functions. And so again, there will be a phone zap if folks are interested in joining. It'll be a Zoom meeting and it will all be on together. and have a script and have information to help us to make those calls, to make it clear to the White House. There's already folks reaching out, as Ronald has pointed out, to representatives and to senators and local electeds, but really also because the White House is the driver of much of this. We want to make sure that folks are also reaching out to the White House and making it clear that these attacks on asylum should stop, and making it clear what we think should happen instead. And so if folks want to get more information about that, who should or how they should reach out to? How do they get in contact with BAJI to get that information?
Right. So, well, they can directly reach out to our policy manager, Erica Baganza, at Erica, ERICA, at baji.org, and myself, Ronald at baji.org. And we'd be happy to help them get more information about the phone zap that will be happening on Thursday. And again, it's targeting the White House because as important as it is to, reach out to your electeds in terms of the House and the Senate and local government, it's very important that the other side of this negotiation table with Republicans and some Democrats is this president's administration. So we must make sure that we are making it clear to them, even though it should be, that this is not unacceptable.
Absolutely. And that is baji.org, spelled BAJI.org. Thank you so very much, Ronald, for joining us. Really appreciate you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.